We have with us our chairperson, Dr. Neena Gupta-Vich. She is an assistant professor in the Department of English, Central University of Jammu, UT of Jammu and Kashmir. She has worked on T.S. Eliot from her for MPhil and dissertation, and in an area of gender and feminist study for her PhD research. Her research interests includes contemporary women's writing in English and English translation, translation studies, contemporary writing, women's writing, American literature, Afro-American writing, native literature, Chicano literature, and diasporic studies. Currently, she is working on Indian myths, mythology, and autobiographies. She is a member of the Shakespeare Association India and Indian Association of Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies, and FSLE India. So we welcome you, ma'am, and honored to have you again with us to listen to your sweet voice. Welcome, ma'am.
Yeah, good afternoon, Shubhra. Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. I've been here for the last 1 hour and listening to the proceedings. It is very, very stimulating. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to the forum for giving me this chance. Thank you. Yeah, I look ahead. Are the participants all there? Dr. Jambal?
Yes, ma'am. We can start. I think I can see the first presenter, and I'll let you know in the meantime.
Yes, yes.
Ma'am, you have the list of presenters, right?
Yes, yes. We have the first presenter is Jayashri and Atri, Jayashri Tripura and Atri Majumdar, and they are speaking on extenuating migration, climate change, essentializing the feminine, a comparative study of Amitabh Ghosh's Gun Island and Salman Rushdie's Quixote. So is that,
yes,
are they ready?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am, just a minute. Hello, is that I'm audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Hello?
Can you
Okay.
can you come
Yeah,
on?
I'll
You
yeah,
can
sure.
be visible also.
Is my PPT visible?
Yes, it was.
Is it visible, ma'am?
Yes, it is visible. Carry on, please.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay, a very good afternoon to one and all. Firstly, I'm very much grateful to get such a platform in a virtual mode where we discuss various sort of issues in this pandemic time, of course. So here my topic is accentuating migration, climate change, and essentializing the feminine, a comparative study of Amitabh Ghosh's Gun Island and Salman Rushdie's Quixote. It is presented by Jayashri Tripura. The objectives of the paper are to trace the root cause behind the displacement and unstoppable transition of migrants, to examine the nature-culture dichotomy and its symbolic attachments to gender, to explore the topical issues represented in the text with regards to environmental politics, migration, and feminism. So my presentation will be divided into three parts. Firstly, I'll discuss about dominant female characters from both novel. Secondly, I'll discuss about resisting gender essentialism. Thirdly, I'll discuss about climate change and apocalypse. So both this novel, Gun Island and Quixote, has been written in 2019, and Salman Rushdie's Quixote delineates a gamut of topical concerns relevant to contemporary times. As reviewed by Los Angeles book, Brian Finney praises the book as a typical Rushdie melange, spilling over with invention and defying narrative convention with glee, marvelous conclusion by a masterly writer. Rushdie presents the themes explored in the novel through the metafictional author's description of his aspirations. To quote, to take on the destructive, mind-numbing junk culture of his time, just as Cervantes had gone to war with the junk culture of his own age to write about impossible obsessional love, father-son relationships, sibling quarrels, Indian migrants, racism towards them, crooks among them, about cyber spies, science fiction, the intervening of the fictional and the real realities, the death of the author, the end of the world, wanted to incorporate elements of the parodic and of satire and pastiche. So from here itself, we get to know the gist of the novel. So Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island was originally published on 6 June 2019. It is the 10th novel by Amitav Ghosh. The Gun Island tells tale about the refugee crisis in the world. Amitav Ghosh has assembled and created a well-planned rendezvous of both nature and crisis of humanity. The Gun Island revolves around 3 generations. Ashish Khaka in a newspaper, in a reviewed newspaper, he says that, to quote, Ghosh does reflect the narrow-mindedness of right-wing regimes. It is more to do with the issue of refugees than with climate change, unquote. Harsimran Gill states that, to quote, Ghosh ties in the global movement of refugees in search of new lives and livelihoods as survival in their homelands becomes impossible, with climate change gesturing at these two phenomena being effect and cause respectively, unquote. Now, there are some dominant female characters from both the books. The first character I'll discuss from the novel Kishore, Salma R, is at top of her profession as an actress. So she is an actress, and to quote from the book itself, I would just try to figure out her character analysis, or sort of what sort of occupation she does. She came from fame and money and made even more money and achieved even greater fame on her own, becoming the first Indian actress to make it big in America, to cross what might be called the Woodbridge from Bolly to Holly, and then transited even Hollywood to become a brand, a television talk show superstar, and Titanic cultural influencer in America and India too. So Salma R is a very contemporary character. I would say that she's a kind of woman. She's an actress, and she is somebody who has made her own identity itself. So there's another character, Sister, from the same novel, Kishore. Sister studied in a law school in UK, a successful lawyer with a strong interest in civil and human rights issues, a stalwart fighter on behalf of minorities and the urban poor, who has devoted a good proportion of her time to pro bono work, unquote. She was even nominated for a peerage in the House of Lords. Kishore's sister, the trampoline, amassed a large wealth in Wall Street while she was in her 20s and started running to quote, her own organization, generating global funding to offer small loans to women in South Asia, trying to start up their own enterprises, beauty parlors, food catering, child daycare centers, also fighting sex trafficking, campaigning against sexual violence towards women in India. So from these 3 characters, we can, or maybe Kishore's sister portrays a sort of empowered woman who also like to empower other women. Now, from this novel, Gun Island, we have Pia Roy. She is a Bengali American who is actually a catalogist. She comes here for the winter like you and usually stays with my aunt. She is here now, and she will make arrangements if you decide to visit. So she is a sort of Indian American woman. She has also her own identity into the novel itself. Now here we have Nilima Bose, who is born into a wealthy Calcutta legal dynasty. Nilima had defied her family by marrying an impoverished school teacher. This was way back in the early 1950s. After the marriage, Nilima had moved with her husband to Lushibari, a small town on the edge of the Sundarbans. A few years later, she has founded a group, a trust, on a trust, a charitable trust, that is Padabon Trust. And from this trust itself, she has a lot of extended work like free hospitals, schools, clinics, and workshops. And she also employs a large number of women into her organization. Now we have two more characters from the novel Gun Island, Sinta and Durga. Sinta was a figure of note on many counts, both glamorous and brilliant. She was already a well-regarded historian, so she is basically a historian and had published an authoritative study of the Inquisition in Venice. Now Durga, we already know she is a warrior goddess. She was a legend already. Durga went out of town without telling me anything about where she was going. This was not unusual, of course, except that this time she did not come back. A few days later, I found out that she had been shot by the police in an encounter. So she is a rebel, and she used to work into various political active groups. Now, resisting gender essentialism. Before, in both the novels, we have seen both the writers have focused on resisting gender essentialism, or we can say that a sort of contemporary women characters were represented in both the novels. Firstly, I will explain what does gender essentialism means. According to Wikipedia, gender essentialism is a concept used to examine the attribution of fixed, intrinsic, innate qualities to women and men. In this theory, there are certain universal, innate, biologically and psychologically based features of gender that are at the root of observed differences in the behavior of men and women. In the mid-20th century, alternatives to gender essentialism were proposed. During second wave feminism, Simone de Beauvoir and other feminists in the 1960s and 70s theorized just that gender differences were socially constructed. So it is created into the social world itself. So these are some critics who have focused on the term gender essentialism. Carrier Petcher notes that to quote, femininity is conceived in strongly essentialist and stereotypical terms, unquote, and new feminists, unquote, quote, which valorize assertiveness, individuality, and achievement, are not regarded as masculine because they maintain powerful markers of conventional femininity, unquote. Gender essentialism plays a pivotal role in the formation of identities, and Florian Kalmus observes that in the West, admonitions to avoid essentialism are of relatively recent origin, and with regard to identity, not always heeded. Identity has moved from absolute sameness to perceived similarity, common interests, shared gods, shared space, shared history, and shared lifestyle, unquote. So the last, that is climate change and apocalypse. So in both the novel we see a concern of environmental disbalances being created into the book itself, where both the writers has written into the novel that this is the time that we should be aware about climate and environmental disbalances which is created by human itself. So climate change and apocalypse. Shashi Tharoor and Samir Saran observe that, to quote, the world's poorest suffer the most when ecosystems are degraded. Today, for the first time, environmental refugees outnumber political refugees. So sometimes, not sometimes, basically in this contemporary era, we see a large number of migration is occurring. And we can say that in this 21st century is supposed to be the age of migration, where a large number of refugees we see, in various parts of the world. And there is a whole lot of identity crisis into the refugees itself. And if we look deep into this matter, why the refugees, why the people are moving from one place to another, sometimes it belongs to some, economical, political reasons. But in the recent time, it is basically for environmental changes also. Dylan and Harris notes that, to quote, the way we largely come to know about climate change is through the language of science, but this is not a universal language. Telling stories, however, is a shared experience. Stories make the symbolic visceral, the unknowable known with regards to climate change and our perceived inability to address it. Stories, when listened to, provide not only a roadmap for understanding where we are, but are also a point of departure from the status quo, unquote. In Kishore, Rushdie presents the premonitions of an imminent apocalypse as their generation, having made a royal mess of the planet, was on its way out. Unquote. Though Rushdie incorporates science fictional elements into the narrative with ruptures and voids appearing in the sky and people migrating into another planet, his message is abundantly clear. To quote from the book, the universe is fraying at the edges, it's coming apart. We need to recognize that and take action, unquote. In The Gun Island, Ghosh has narrated the consequences of climate change, or from various other novels, we can from Amitav Ghosh's novel, we can see that in Hungry Tide, The Great Derangement, where he has aware the reader that climatic changes are happening, and there are a lot of events that he has discussed into his various recent books. I quote, I made the acquaintance of Cyclone Isla, which hit the Sundarbans in 2009, was quite different from the cyclones of the past. Starting in the late 1990s, warning systems for storms had been put in place across the region, so there was plenty of time to prepare. Mass evacuations had been planned in advance, and millions of people were moved to safety in India and in Bangladesh. As a result, the casualty count was surprisingly low, at least in relation to the cyclone of 1970, unquote. The Sundarbans had always attracted traffickers because of its poverty. To quote, after Ayla, they had descended in swarms, spiriting women off to distant brothels and transported able-bodied men to work sites in faraway cities or even abroad. Many of those who left were never heard from again. So here we can say that there are various repercussions to natural disasters where Sundarbans is most affected, where we can see that there is they don't have a permanent sort of solution to it, as there are a lot of cyclones happening, and there are women doesn't have any work, men doesn't have any work. It's like when they go for fishing into the Sundarbans and they don't connect, they don't see each other on the next ride. Next to that is making a life, to quote from the book itself, making a life in Sundarbans had become so hard that the exodus of the young was accelerating every year. Boys and girls were borrowing and stealing to pay agents to find them work elsewhere. Some were sleeping over the border into Bangladesh to join labor gangs headed for the Gulf, and if they had failed, they would pay traffickers to smuggle them to Malaysia or Indonesia on boats, unquote. This is done through the experiences of extreme weather events, from an unusual hailstorm to a devastating cyclone, but also through quieter encounters with the natural invasions that urban populations are increasingly not able to even contemplate. A snake bite in Los Angeles, a venomous spider in a big city apartment that has never been seen before. It is in the terror of these moments that our utter lack of preparedness with the hugest consequences of climate change, when they come, is reflected. Ghosh reminds us through his scholar characters that the world has already witnessed the Little Ice Age. So he also discussed about apocalypse into his novel The Gun Island. As writer and editor Aditya Mani Jha points out, the very naming of him as the gun merchant evokes the racist idea that immigrants bring violence and crime with them to the pristine neighborhoods of the global north. So this particular picture actually depicts what sort of environmental migration is happening to various parts of the world, where one person is moving not for the, of course, economical and social problems are there, and along with it due to environmental issues as well. So I'd like to conclude, both Rushdie and Ghosh writes about contemporary issues, and they can be called as literary cosmopolitans. In both the novels, we come across the crisis of climate change, and a sense of apocalypse is created in order to make us aware about the serious environmental crisis. Both the writers have portrayed the emerging new world where women are ambitiously unconventional and are very likely to empower other women in order to sustain the gender authoritativeness. So these are the references. With this poem, with this excerpt from Emily Dickinson's poem, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. So with this note, I would like to end my presentation saying, hoping that we will take care of nature as well as women who, or as the women who would like to empower other women. So this is the hope, and with this hope, I would like to end my presentation.
Thank you so much, Jayashree. That was indeed an interesting presentation. And I'm glad that
Thank you, ma'am.
yeah, you are sticking to the time limit, since we have 4 more presenters and we have to finish in an hour. I think, Dr. Jamwal, do we have till 1:30 since we started late? I think she's taking a break. Okay, so now I have the next speakers are the next speaker is Smitakshi Chaudhary. Are you ready, Dr. Samakshi?
Yes, ma'am. Am
Smitakshi,
I
yes.
audible?
Yes, you are audible, and you are speaking on deconstructing gender roles, the female body as the site of resistance in the selected fiction of Sadat Hassan Manto. That's very interesting, going back. Yes, yes.
Okay.
Now over to you.
Ma'am, am I audible? Yeah, ma'am. Am
Yes,
I
you're
audible?
audible. You're audible, but you could
Right.
turn on the volume a little. You could just turn on the volume a little for me.
Just a second, ma'am. I'll just see if the volume is.
Could move a little closer, perhaps.
Yes,
Hmm.
ma'am. Just a second. Is it better, ma'am?
Yes,
Is it
better.
okay?
Hmm.
Yes. So basically, research in research on Manto's work has tended to focus on basically a post-colonial aspect. But in recent years, there have been attempts to situate his work in the context of feminist theory. A close reading of Manto's work, in my opinion, reveals a motive, that is the motive of the female body. Uh, Manto uses the female body as a means of exposing and challenging patriarchy, as well as uses it to deconstruct gender roles. I intend to point out the literary strategies by which he does this. The female body is not just used as a representation of communal violence, nor is the ravaged female body merely a metaphor for the ravaged or partitioned subcontinent. Uh, there are specific instances when the female body is used to nullify patriarchy. Early feminism looked at gender from both essentialist and anti-essentialist perspectives. Either way, it recognized the differences between the genders. What Manto does is he continuously negates, obliterates, and refuses to recognize gender in certain conditions, and in certain instances, he subverts the gender roles. Women take control of their own bodies in his fiction. The body in certain instances is no longer the male, it's no longer male or female. It is brought down to the entity, as an entity, it is brought down to the level of the human. It is done by bringing the woman's body to a primal biological and human level. This is how he does that. So due to time constraints, I will make it as fast as I can. I will be citing some particular short stories of Manto. Of course, he uses the female body to underscore the senselessness and horror of the partition. In perhaps, in what is perhaps his most chilling tale, Kholdo, or The Return, we get the story of an abducted girl who is lying in a refugee hospital. When the attendant doctor asks someone to open the window, the girl, who is obviously in shock, she pulls down her trousers. The effect is horrific. She seems to have been raped by both her abductors as well as the Pakistani volunteers who rescue her. And now she equates every man's motive with rape. The doctor breaks into a cold sweat when he sees these horrific incidents unfolding in front of his eyes. And I think he is by no means the only one. We, as readers, also freeze. Coming to the next story, Colder Than Ice, in this story, several complex issues come to the fore. For example, it talks about a man named Ishar Singh who joins roaming bands of looters and ending up raping a woman after killing 6 members of her family. He comes home in a daze to his lover Kalwant Kaur, who is portrayed as a woman, very much in control of her sexuality. However, Ishar Singh, interestingly, is unable to make love to her, and she suspects that he has cheated on her. When he does accept that there was another woman involved, what she does is, in a rage, she plunges his short sword, which is called a kirpan, into his neck. The kirpan, or the short sword, of being an obvious phallic symbol. So, he does, in his dying moments, as he lies bleeding, he confesses that, he had abducted a girl and whom he had thought to be unconscious for the time being, but much later on, he finds out that she had long been dead, and this incident renders him impotent. So, what is obvious is the paralysis of the perpetrator. Women's body in this light does not simply act as the site on which violence is inscribed, but it also becomes an important site of resistance, even in death. Going on to the next story called Moselle, in it we get the description of a man named Taluchan, a Sikh guy named Taluchan, who is in love with a Jewish woman named Moselle. Although she resists his advances, he ends up settling for a simple girl from his own community. Moselle helps him out and his fiancée when the occasion comes. When a band of bloodthirsty attackers attack the building in which Tarluchan's fiancée lives, Moselle rushes to the aid. She shows incredible presence of mind, asking Tarluchan to dress like a Muslim. She exchanges her Jewish garb with Tarluchan's fiancé so that they can safely escape. Moselle herself climbs down the stairs naked, and this distracts the angry group of protesters. She slips and falls down the stairs, and as she lies bleeding, a man tries to cover her body with a sheet. Her words to the man seem to be that of Mantu. She says, "Off with it, your blasted religion." Here, the naked body is neither male nor female, it is simply human, and the roles are reversed in such striking manner. Again, there is another motive which I find very interesting, which is the recurring figure of the sex worker in Mantu's fiction. Mantu does not just portray them as utterly hopeless, but he also shows the dignity and resilience in them. They take control of their lives even within the limited circumstances in which they live. The first story that I will cite in this respect is called A Woman's Life, describing the life of Sogandhi, a sex worker. And she's shown to be a woman who has long made peace with the conditions that she has to live in, and yet she never stops falling in love. She is portrayed as someone who has an infinite capacity for love and frequently helps out others, including her lover, mostly out of her own meager incomes. The men in her life treat her badly, whether it be the pimp who cares little more than business, she waking her up at odd hours, and she's expected to work despite a splitting headache, or her lover Madhu, who swindles her of her income and never gives her anything despite repeated promises. On one occasion, a businessman comes to look at her, and he drives off into the night uttering a grunt of disgust. This serves as a rude awakening, and she comes to realize that the men in her life have always taken from her. When Madhu comes back, trying yet again to cozen money out of her, what she does is she smashes his framed picture on the wall. So she, hello, am I audible?
Yes. Yes, you are. You are. Carry on.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Carry on, please.
Okay. So yes, I will. So this serves as a rude awakening, and she knows that she finally calls him out for being this disgusting, selfish, and opportunistic man that he is. I would like to concentrate on the ending of the story. She takes a dog. There's a mangy old dog in her room who is her companion. She picks up the dog from the floor, and she goes to sleep, throwing an arm around the dog, thereby signifying that she finally prefers the company of a dog over that of opportunistic men any day. There is another story which I would like to cite in this regard. The name of the story is Kushia. It is uh, about a sex worker named Kanta, who is unapologetic about her own sexuality. The pimp, Fushia, is flabbergasted, as she does not react to his male gaze at all. The pimp visits her and has the nerve to tell her to dress properly in front of him. And she merely shrugs off that suggestion and just says that it is just you. I'm not going to dress properly because it is you standing in the room. However, this is very significant because, this is a nullifying statement if we look at it that way. This hurts his pride, and he feels she does not acknowledge him as a man. The punishment he has in store for her at the end, because of this apparent blow to his ego, is left vague as Kushia picks up Kanta and signals of the driver of the car to drive off. But what I would like to point out is, although she faces the consequences, she successfully nullifies the male gaze and male ego. Manto's another story that is sort of memorable is 10 rupees, in which a young girl who works as a part-time sex worker is taken out for a ride by two young men. They end up going up to the beach where they have a memorable time. Nothing untoward happens. When they return, she gives back the 10 rupees that the men that the men had paid for her for the outing, and it leaves the men bewildered. Women like sex workers are seen as human beings capable of more generosity and compassion than the men who exploit them. Now, there's one more interesting point that I would like to make. It is not always about women who are in the prime of their life, in Manto's fiction. I find one story very memorable for his portrayal of an old woman. It's called The Woman in the Red Raincoat, where a woman is forcibly picked up by a young man during a ride. He presumes her to be young, her face being hidden by the hood of a raincoat. As they get home, her face is not visible. The lights do not come back until much later. Although initially resistant to the man's advances, she relents once he assures her that he would not take advantage of her or do anything against her wishes. When as he views her face in the light, it becomes clear that she is a much older woman. The man is disgusted and he asks her to leave if she wants. Later, narrating this tale to his friend, he comes to know that she happened to be an artist whose paintings he himself had often tried to copy as a boy in school. He learns that she is no more. His friend adds that she had apparently hated men. What is significant is that night she had seemed to change into someone very different, just with a bit of appreciation, signaling that it is a human being's primary need to be loved and appreciated for who they are. In another story named Mummy, Manto describes another woman past her prime who maintains an establishment in Noida where she hosts several gatherings. Manto visits her house with his friend Chadda, while the narrator himself is, initially disgusted by her flashy clothes and wrinkles showing on her badly painted face, and is also very suspicious about the kind of establishment that she hosts. He soon discovers that she is indeed a woman to be admired. She helps people in need and serves as a mother figure to many of Manto's own friends. When Chadda behaves, Chadda is Manto's friend, who, at a party he behaves inappropriately with the girl. She she comes to the rescue of this particular girl, causing Chadda to admit at the end of the story that she had cured him of his lust that night, or he would have done something very untoward. So in conclusion, I would like to say that Manto's use of the female body is threefold. He uses it as a powerful symbol to portray female sexuality. Another point that I would like to make is Manto does not set much store in figurative language. He has no qualms about describing parts of the female anatomy by their names. And he uses the female body to deconstruct gender roles in various ways, as I have already illustrated through my examples. He used the female body, in some cases ravaged and lifeless, if I may say so, to subvert patriarchy. and he used the female body to, of course, show the locus on which partition violence was inscribed. His strategy, however, is not limited to that alone. He challenges the prevailing notions about women in many of his stories, like I said. In most of them, we as readers are made to look beyond the surface to acknowledge the humanity of the person. The body no longer remains male or female, it is brought down to the level of the human. I would like to end my presentation with the following, by citing the following lines from Fahmida Riaz's, Fahmida Riaz, who is a Pakistani poet and activist, and her quote becomes very relevant in this regard. It is strange that other writers, especially in Urdu, are so blind to the reality of women. They would not even notice bravery or intelligence in their female subjects. On the contrary, they're capable of giving the most perverse psychological twist to the most remarkable traits in a woman. Even today, Manto stands more or less alone in the position that he takes on women. After Manto, there is none like Manto. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Smitakshi. It was a very interesting, insightful, and I must confess that I have read a bit of Manto, but not so much. And now I'm made me very keen to read him in detail, because somehow I've missed studying him in so much. And I suppose that's a very important aspect of your presentation, because sometimes in trying to go towards newer areas, we overlook how certain authors have been able to go beyond their time and look at something which nobody else can see. And in fact, we are in a kind of what do you call, reactionary era, in which all kinds of reactions against women's empowerment is also emerging in different ways, which is what your Urdu, what the Urdu writers are perhaps trying to establish, that women are worthy only of romance and adulation, and cannot be acknowledged as equals. Sometimes it happens like that. Anyway, we'll have those discussions at the end. I would like all the presenters to get a chance to say exactly what they want. I think you did a good job, 10 minutes. So the others, also please, if you can just sum it up, then maybe we'll have some time for discussions. I invite Ananya Banerjee to speak now. Yes, you are speaking on Pashmina, transgressing the quest for identity. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, very audible. Yes, you can carry on.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, one and all present over here. I am Ananya Banerjee, PGT English in Burnpur Riverside School, West Bengal. I'm thankful to the organizers for arranging such a wonderful conference and for providing me an opportunity to present my paper here. The title of my paper is Pashmina, Transgressing the Quest for Identity. My focus will be entirely on the identity crisis suffered by the women characters due to various reasons, as discussed in Nidhi Chanani's Pashmina, which is a graphic novel. Before starting with my presentation, I would like to speak a few words on the author Nidhi Chanani and a graphic novel as a modern genre of representation of thoughts. Nidhi Chanani is an Indo-American freelancer, illustrator, and artist. Her debut graphic novel, Pashmina, has been honored with various awards, and in April 2012, Nidhi was honored at the White House as a champion of change. Starting with the second half of the 20th century, many artists have written graphic novels, which are type of text combining words and images. Through these graphic novels, various socio-political complex issues are being argued upon. In this graphic novel, Pashmina, Chanani has proved that women are not just a pale reflection of their male counterpart. They too have their own existence, their own identity. The word identity is a many-sided phenomenon. The postmodern world is going through cultural mutations, and the basic question in today's world is about the individual's position and situation in the society. The graphic novel Pashmina reasons out the hidden theme of alienation, which cornerstones identity crisis and the quest for the same. Though being a young author, Chenani with the graphics has marvelously portrayed the people's suffering and existential estrangement. The despair and suffering that the people endure are clearly extrapolated with the help of graphics in the novel Pashmina. One can easily sensitize the situation when they see the graphics and read the quotes representing the thoughts of the character and feel the pangs of isolation due to the cultural identity loss, gender identity loss, or identity loss due to the absence of one's knowledge of our roots. My presentation is divided into three parts. In the first part, I would like to talk upon the search for diasporic identity in the novel Pashmina. The globalized version of the world has brought the world under a nutshell where people easily migrate from one place to another due to various reasons. This urban migration, though superficially seems to be successful, yet it leaves behind a trail of cultural confrontation and identity crisis. The expatriates often are the prey to an alienated environment which urges one to search for their own identity. They oscillate between cultural adaptation and self-identity. Due to this alienation, they feel confused about their own individual existence. In Pashmina, we see the same kind of existential crisis being suffered by Priyanka, whose roots are ground to India but had to settle down in California with her mother. She felt herself alienated from the culture around her in California. Various questions churned her mind. Who was her father? Why did her mother leave India? Why doesn't her mother want to visit India anymore? She leads a confused life and tries to adjust herself by adopting the culture and life of California. In spite of being brought up in California, Priyanka was not quite an American. She was a social outcast among the cool girls at school who teased her for not wearing clothes that fit in. Amidst this mental turmoil, Priyanka finds a home when, in her fantasy, she gets transported to the colorful, magical world of India with the help of the magical Pashmina shawl that she discovered inside an abandoned old suitcase. She dreamt of a romanticized version of India and felt to be at her real home where she would trace her original culture, her root, and aspire to be there. Every time when she wraps the Pashmina shawl, she could feel being in the idyllic version of India where she longed to travel. This unfulfilled longing for her country gradually frustrated her. Her frustration grew to such an extent that Priyanka rudely confronted her mother by saying, I quote here from the novel, quote, maybe you should have stayed there with my dad, unquote. She was caught in a limbo between two different cultural traditions, the East and the West. As a result, she herself was not sure about her own identity, culture, and traditions. She was so much subdued by her identity crisis that she hated her Indianized name Priyanka and asked people to call her Pri. The next part of my presentation is about gender identity loss that is suffered by modern women on being challenged and suppressed by the patriarchal male-dominated society. Modern women no longer want her to be projected as the vulnerable or the one who is emotionally and financially dependent. They no longer want to restrict themselves as being called a traditional woman who would stoically endure all pains imposed by the patriarchal society. Rather, they fight against their crisis, feelings, tortures, emotional imbalances, and try to explore their own self or their own identity. In this graphic novel, Chenani tries to bring forth the identity quest of Priyanka's mother, Nimisha, and her Meena Mosi. Pashmina depicts a picture of Indian women whose wholehearted devotion and duties towards their families hegemonize their own desires and longings. Meena Mosi's character clearly picturizes the fact she is always suppressed by her husband, whose domination she accepts calmly. She always tries to accept the orders being imposed upon by her husband. Through the use of graphics, Chenani portrays Meena Mosi's inner feelings, which she tries to conceal from the world. She loved to teach the poor kids of a slum in Jadavpur. She is an epitome of a traditional Indian woman who always compromises with her longings and adjusts to her family. She started teaching the girls only after getting the permission from her husband, but again, at the order of her husband, had to leave it immediately when she was pregnant. Priyanka's mother, Nimisha, was victimized by the patriarchal society as she disobeyed the unwritten societal codes of conduct. She was convinced to visit Rahul before their marriage and was denied by Rahul to marry after being pregnant with his child. Nimisha thereafter never turned to Rahul for her or her daughter's survival. She became the new woman with a strong personality who had the courage to subsist in a foreign land away from her so-called near and dear ones. She created a new world of her own in California, where she had striven hard to establish an identity beyond the patriarchal force that threatened her self-identity in India. The last part of my presentation is about the identity loss faced due to the absence of Pri's knowledge about her roots in Pashmina. It is said that a person's journey for existence is somewhat dependent on her parental roots. A person feels a crisis in her existence when that root is missing. The same thing happens in Pri's life. She was denied of the basic knowledge about her father. Right from her childhood, Uncle Jatin was like the father figure for Pri. She underwent a traumatic psychic experience when Uncle Jatin said that he may not be available for the frequent outings after his own baby arrives. Her entire existence was as if uprooted for the second time. Due to this suffocating isolation, she finally decided to visit India to have the knowledge of her past and get back the relations that she has been deprived of. In the conclusion, I want to say that in the entire graphic novel Pashmina, we can see that the Pashmina shawl acted as a catalyst in effectuating the crisis and liberating every individual from their entanglement of their existence. Through the women protagonists, Chanani has voiced the sufferings of thousands of women who are mentally, emotionally, physically, and psychologically dominated and tortured at every step of their life. The Pashmina shawl is actually the women's own dreams and aspirations, which enable them to realize what they want. It enables them to foresee the things that are hidden in their minds. In the novel, whenever Pri, her mother, or her Mosi suffered from depressions or hostility with their own selves, the shawl acted as an agent to make their ever-challenging and difficult life subtle. And at the end of the novel, we find Pri asking Eddie to call her Priyanka. She championed in her discovery of a new and independent identity. She reversed her position and completed her quest for identity by emerging as a writer of her own comic book, Pashmina. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananya. That was a very interesting presentation on a new area. And yes, Pashmina. I mean, you can see the hybrid, the hybrid genre. It has taken in a lot of tropes from a lot of literary works. Very interesting. Thank you. I would just, like to remind all the other participants that they can ask their questions, put them in the chat box, and at the end of the session, we'll address all the questions. Is that all right, Dr. Jamwal? Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
We'll post all of them later. Yeah, so please stay be here. So now we have the next presenter, Uttam Barua, is a PhD scholar from the Department of English, Rajiv Gandhi University. He's speaking on reading Plato's Symposium, The Voice Against Gender Dilemma. Yes, are you ready? Oh, you're not there, Uttam?
I'm just having a look. I cannot find somebody named Uttam in the list.
Okay.
Maybe with some other name.
Okay, shall we just move to?
Is he Uttam? He has an issue, so he has switched his presentation during last session. So please move on. for me.
Okay, okay. So shall I move to the next
Yes.
presenter? Yes, yes. The next is K. Roshan Goldwyn. Yes, yes, she's been coming on and off to sort of check whether she's on. Yes, you're on now. She's an MPhil scholar, PG and research departments in John's College, Tirunelveli from Tamil Nadu. And she's speaking on marginalization and identity issues of an ethnic group in John Masters, Bhavani Junction. Yes, are you ready?
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, I'm ready. Okay, good afternoon, and all. And
I'm so
it's an
sorry.
immense pleasure.
Was it? I could see a lady there earlier. That's why I made this mistake. Who?
No, that's no problem.
What is that? Okay, I'm so sorry. This is. Shall I reintroduce you? Roshan Goldman is going to speak. He is going to speak on marginalization. Okay, carry on, please.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It's an immense pleasure to be here. And my topic is marginalization and identity issues of an ethnic group in John Masters Bhavani Junction. Actually, the tendency to exclude a particular group or community from a mainstream can be called as marginalization. And this concept is introduced by Robert Park in 1928. And in the work, Midnight Orphans, Anglo-Indians in Post-Colonial Literature, Glenn D. Cruz states the Robert Park's lines. Ordinarily, the marginal man is a mixed blood, like mulatto in United States and Eurasian in Asia. But that is apparently because the man of mixed blood is one who lives in two worlds, in both of which he is a stranger. So India was colonized by many countries such as Dutch, French, and English. Anglo-Indians came into existence after the arrival of British. And in this novel, John Master, it is published in 1954, and it is set in 1946 to 47 before India got independence. Bhavani Junction, in this novel, there are two characters, Patrick and Victoria. They are the representatives of the community in this novel. And the first of all, marginal situations are developed because of some practices that has been followed, and that makes the status of a group unequal. For example, in this novel, they both are worked in Indian Railway Department, Traffic Department. They are supposed to wear a khaki uniform and a topi, a cap, which is for Anglo-Indians. So this topi, this cap, is physically differentiate them from the British and the Indians. And um, and usually, Anglo-Indians try to mimic British in order to show that they are superior to Indians. At the same time, British consider Anglo-Indians as inferiors. So this is clearly illustrated by Patrick. He says, the trouble of being that we Anglo-Indians didn't want to sing to the level of Indians, and Indians hated us for being superior to them. So this is the problem. And the next thing is most of the Anglo-Indians consider England as their home. They don't want to mingle with Indians. And Patrick also had the thought at first, but
Excuse me, Roshan. I mean, your voice is at times a little inaudible. Is it because of the connectivity?
no,
Yeah. Okay.
now can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little better.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So most of the Anglo-Indians considered England as their home. So Patrick had also had the thought like that, but British couldn't take in Anglo-Indians with them. This reason is clearly illustrated by Patrick himself. He states, "Going home were mere foolishness, and I know it. The whole point that made it impossible to give way, even to argue, was that we couldn't go home. We couldn't become English because we were half Indian. We couldn't become Indian because we were half English. So we could only stay where we were and be what we were." So Anglo Indians don't want to think India as their home. And Once Victoria knows that British couldn't take them home, she starts to find herself as an Indian. So, as a result, she starts to wear saris and she starts to love Ranjit, a nice gentleman, an Indian who is an assistant of Patrick. But as love grows between Victoria and Ranjit, Victoria starts to feel a cultural clash. Basically, Anglo-Indian's culture is similar to British, and but it is entirely different from Indian. So, for example, women smoking in public and kissing in public, these are all not accepted in Indian culture. But and it is clearly seen in the conversation between Ranjit and Victoria. When Victoria asks Ranjit to kiss her, he says that it is wrong. We couldn't do this in public, and we should do this after our marriage. So like that, he says, and but Victoria says that we think it's an insulting for a man not to kiss a girl who asks him. So here he feels there is an invisible screen between her and Indians. So this made her to goes to fall into another uh, kind person, a British colonel, Rodney Savage, and he is a British man, and he. Here we could see that it is not a kind of love, but it is a need for an hour, because the pathetic situation of Anglo-Indian women is portrayed in so many Raj literatures. In Midnight Orphans, Glenn D. Close's Midnight Orphans, he says that Raj literature commonly assumes that any single Anglo-Indian woman must be in want of a white man, or the white man represents a ticket into a legitimate world of the colonizer. So this is also, but the state of an Anglo-Indian woman in British is not that much good. It is also illustrated by another character, Mrs. Molly. Victoria thinks about her Molly's words that she was really trying to warn me that everything is not wonderful for Anglo-Indians in England, not in the upper classes. Then she was reminding me that if we had children, one might be as white as you, and the other very darker than matter. So these two incidents indirectly states that Victoria does not belong to India as well as Britain. Now the question of where do I belong in this portrays the state of homelessness. According to Homi K. Baba, the state of unhomely is not a state of lacking a home, but it is a creeping acknowledgement that the line between the world and the home are breaking down. So he states he states in the location of culture. He says to be unhomed is not to be homeless, nor can the unhomely be easily accommodated in that familiar division of social life into private and public spheres. The unhomely moment creeps up on you stealthily as your own shadow, and suddenly you find yourself with Henry James's Isabel Archer in the portrait of a lady. And so this shows Victoria tries to become Indian, but she's not an Indian. Then she tries to become an English, but she is not an English. The idea of future throws her to Ranjit, and then the sense of belongingness throws her to Rodney Savage. So when and this so what is the solution is that uh, being an Anglo-Indian is their true identity, and this is illustrated by Rodney Savage, and he says we talked about the future of the people. When we English left India, they could look beyond the telegraph lines and the railway lines. There would be nothing they could not achieve then, depending only upon themselves. So it is apt to quote the words, the poem lines of Henley in Invictus. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. So whenever the problems may occur, situations may become even worse. One should not lose hope. Um, Anglo-Indians' fate is in their own hands. Actually, at first, Anglo-Indians developed their own culture. Their mother tongue is English, and they have their food list such as pepper water, railway lamb curry, etc. After the Indian independence, the hybrid community lost its identity. This ethnic group begins to mingle with the adopted country in order to survive. So, the population after the independence of India, the population of Anglo Indians are approximately 2 million. But now it reduces to 3 to 4 lakhs. And uh, maybe marrying into their own community helps to revive this ethnic group from fading. And though Bhavani Junction is the best work uh, in his career, it is highly underrated by so many critics because the main content of this novel is about Anglo Indians. Even this novel is adapted into film in 1956. In that, they changed the climax itself. Actually, in the novel, Patrick is alive in the end, and he and Victoria goes to their life. But in the movie, Patrick dies and Rodney Savage takes Victoria. Uh, it shows that it is impossible for the English audience to accept that it is possible for an English man like Rodney Savage, lose Victoria and Anglo-Indian. So this view should have changed. So the change is the only thing that is unchanged. Let's hope the situation of Anglo-Indians will change and may they live.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you so much, Roshan.
Thank you, ma'am.
It has given us another insight into gender through the concept of being marginalized because you don't belong to any one community clearly, any one religion or any one group clearly. And yes, it has been the one of the historical functions of colonialism, that all over the world today we have what you call the Metis, the Matiza, the mixed populations who unfortunately have been left to fend for themselves unless they're fighting for their rights, like in Canada or in Mexico or in America, they're fighting for their rights. But yes, the Anglo-Indian community in India has been left to fend for itself, and they're dwindling. And that's a very interesting intervention in today's proceedings. Thank you so much. Today we had, is that Dr. Jambal? We don't have Uttam here now. Is that all? These are the 4 people who presented?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So today's papers were very interesting since all of them were dealing with particular texts. And Jayashri presented a very insightful paper on how resistance is one of the key things that are happening in the world today, that resistance through or to the gender roles. Secondly, how in Ghana Island as well as in Kishore, both the authors have tried to show how women who tend to empower themselves can also empower other people, and also how the nature culture, the nature human dichotomy can play out in a very healthy way. That island, of course, as usual, Ghosh has managed to put a whole lot of universe, a multiverse in his novel, and so has Rashmi. So at the end, what she was saying was that resistance of any norms, of any essentialism, or any accepted behaviors is a very important aspect of contemporary living. and the way towards a more holistic and more just society. Then Smitakshi gave us a very insightful paper about the female body, analyzing Manto and talking about the body as a site of resistance, but mostly it is through death and how the body is laid waste and it can become a matter of sometimes shame. I wanted to add this, that somewhere the concept of shame is a very important aspect in a kind of a non-violent resistance that we take on. It is without shaming the person who's perpetrating any kind of violence, whether it's sexual or physical. This movement cannot really succeed because force begets force. She has very interestingly given us Pashmina, Ananya, and a look into a graphic novel and how a young girl's quest for identity and is both concerned with her gender, being about being a woman, and also being a diasporic Indian, and how she finds herself by tracing her roots back, but also at the same time accepting change, which is the thing that he has been stressing. Roshan has stressed the idea that change is something that has to be accepted. And so today's session is about those 2-3 things: the acceptance and the stratification of particular rules regarding behavior of men, women, gendering of society, the culture, tradition, dichotomy, and how the way forward is only through understanding change as a more real thing than non-change. So with that, I make the house open for questions. And Dr. Jambal, I hand over to you. Can you see the questions, or how would you like to take the questions?
I don't see any questions. Moreover, if somebody is interested, can ask any question.
Yes. Anybody who would like to ask something? Something that has, I think you've been on since 8:30. Most people are particularly tired also.
Yes, ma'am. So I think we don't have questions. So that's a good luck for all the presenters. No questions. And so moving ahead, thank you so much.